but you wait for 4 hours.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Okay, welcome back everyone to the latest episode of Deep Dive with Richard Haydarian, literally joining you from Southern Europe, something we're going to talk about soon. And as you know, this is an interesting time to be in Europe because finally there may be some movement towards a semblance of justice. And speaking of semblance of justice, I have a very special guest, very good friend of ours on this show, one of our most respected I'm not saying this in a Donald Trump, one of the most respect, not in the real, I mean it in a sincere way. Thank you very much for joining us, Attorney Ruben Caranza. Beautiful morning, beautiful, beautiful, springtime.
Well, thank you for having me again.
Of course, Ruben, since last time we talked, you're a hard man to pin down. Hindi naman Harry Roque level of pin down, but you're a very busy person. Actually, I want to discuss Harry Roque. Why not?
Sure.
Before going to the serious topics, because alam natin, this ICC thing, some would say, well, good, you're cutting off the head of the snake. Soon there could be warrants of arrest for other major, masterminds of the EJK and the war on drugs, or supposed war on drugs. But alam natin naman, this is really an indictment of our justice system, and we had no less than DOJ Secretary Remulla effectively admitting yesterday na nag-fail yung buong judicial system natin, and that's why we had the ICC to come in. But before we go to the ICC, let's talk about the gallery of rogues surrounding Duterte. And I think no one comes to my mind more than Harry Roque. What on earth is he riding the Duterte issue for his own political asylum? And you think he has any chance bilang isang pugante to get asylum on humanitarian or political persecution grounds in Netherlands?
Well, I can't say that I'm very familiar with how the Netherlands, how the Dutch government um, evaluates asylum applications, but I think I'm familiar enough to be able to say that they are liberal when it comes to asylum. Most Western European countries are, except until recently, of course, given what has been happening in, well, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, uh, where the migration towards Europe has been massive and has flooded a lot of the Mediterranean, southern European countries that you're very familiar with.
Taking this. We will talk
And
about Safdar soon, but I see where you're coming from.
but yeah, I think, and I have heard Harry say and that once he applies, that protects him to a significant extent. Um, a lot of people are able to stay while their applications are pending. Um, and at the same time, the notion of political persecution is broad enough that you could conceivably argue that what is happening to you is political persecution, even if it's also other things, even if it possibly is also legal action that might have basis. Uh, the problem, Richard, is that the Philippines, like many other countries, political leaders, those in power, often mix what they can do legally with what they can do with the power they have. And therefore, they become selective about pursuing legal action because they want to preserve the power they have. And it's not, I would say it's not exclusively a Filipino problem or even a global South problem only. We see it happening where I am in the United States. You know, you have power and you have the legal apparatus. You use both, but you only go after certain people. That allows for my law school classmate, my old friend, I should say, Harry Roque. Uh, I was hesitant to say former friend, old friend. Maybe those are the same things, but
Former human rights lawyer, ex-human
uh,
rights.
that probably is the truest description. That allows him to apply for asylum, and I would say he might even get asylum from the Netherlands.
Even if there's, from my reading, no active cases against him, I mean, he can just generically argue this kasi sa pagkaalam ko, yung Quadcom show cause order pa lang, and you could easily argue that, well, that would be moot and academic as soon as a new Congress is adjourned in a few months from now. So there's no active criminal or legal cases or evidence of threat against his life, right? So how do you prove political persecution?
Well, the Asylum Convention does not actually require any specific legal action. That's why the phrasing is persecution based on belief, race, So those are the standards. Those standards don't necessarily require any court proceeding for those standards to be considered.
So, technically speaking, sige patulan na natin. I can apply for asylum in Netherlands saying that I'm now persona non grata in a couple of different cities because some very entrepreneurial DDS troll farms really twisted my ideas and my arguments on the Human Development Index. I think I single-handedly made HDI the most research technical
Mm.
term in development studies the other week. But honestly, as much as I agree that perhaps I should have been even smarter in my 12th interview of the day for a global audience, who of course do not have time for me to break things down barangay by barangay. Obviously, I had to use analogy, and
Mhm.
by my region, I was referring to the Benguet province, which has an HDI of 0.88, which is quite comparable to Croatia, Chile, and some of the more developed countries in the world. And I didn't say that in a yabang way. I said that in a way to just emphasize gaano kalayo yung agwat ng iba't ibang probinsya. At ito yung one of the sources of grievance against the north of the country and so-called Imperial
Mhm.
Manila. Although kami taga Baguio, we also don't like Manila people, just to be clear. So I speak Ilocano when I'm in Baguio. But Ruben, you have been in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think people don't seem to understand what is sub-Saharan Africa. I know it's a colonial term. Southeast Asia is also a colonial, actually World War II military command term that Allied forces use. But obviously, technically speaking, this refers to every country below the Saharan Desert. So it could consider Seychelles, South Africa, Botswana, many very high HDI countries too. You have been to sub-Saharan Africa more than all of us. Can you give us an idea of the diversity? Patulan na natin to. Sige na, for the sake of
Sure.
it.
I
Because
mean,
we saw
look,
this saying
there's
sub-Saharan Mindanao and then parang primitive people lang Africa ang pinapakita. That for me is questionable because if you have been to Durban, you have been to Johannesburg, you have been to actually Ghana, Kenya, many beautiful cities, modern places.
well, there are so many layers here. But first of all, I think it was useful, regardless of. I mean, I commiserate with you, but I think it was also a useful opportunity to help educate people with the problems of measuring development. And because even the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, which runs the rankings of human development indices in the world, I think they would be the first to acknowledge that it's not the most accurate way to compare countries, and because people love to rank things, it also creates a false notion that some countries are more developed than others, and that there are no reasons for that. I mean, there are reasons for why sub-Saharan African countries are, some of them at least, are much, much poorer than even their fellow sub Saharan African countries. South Africa is a sub Saharan African country, but so is Liberia. And I've been to both, I've worked in both countries. Sub Saharan South Africa was, you know, occupied by settler colonizers, people who fled the Netherlands. Um, yeah, and people who created what we now know and criminalize as apartheid. And so that the resource extraction, the racism, the oppression that happened for generations creates wealth, but for whom? So you can have development, a wealthy South Africa, and yet an unequal, even up to now, South Africa. Liberia was occupied the same way by settler colonizers from the United States, slaves who were freed uh, by the racist government in the United States, occupied Liberia. Cut a long story short, led to a massive civil war, a long 14-year war, caused by the settler colonizers. So you have to look at the history of these countries and how they evolved. And as you said, even the term sub-Saharan Africa is a colonial term because really a desert doesn't really tell you much about the difference between what's above it and what's below it. I also work in Tunisia, for example.
If I may push back slightly
Mm-hmm,
on that, I think no, not push back on the colonial Orientalist or whatever legacy, but in the sense that I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and I remember when Morocco played in Qatar. The idea is that if you look at North Africa, yes, there's the Berber culture. Obviously, there's the Moor Berber culture, but there's the Arabic language. There is that commonality
mm-hmm,
with West Asia, particularly Arab Middle East, right? So sometimes parang there's a continuity, kaya nga there's a term Middle East and North
mm-hmm.
Africa. So my
Yeah,
sense,
but
the
yeah,
reason why you say sub-Saharan, because if you want to separate the North Africa Arab-speaking region, who tend to also have quite similar quote-unquote levels of development to West Asian countries, with the exception of the more developed ones, like
yeah, but that becomes also a dangerous term once you layer it with the consequences of colonization. Because Sudan, for example, has a North African community and a sub-Saharan African community, and that the competition among these communities
created.
for land, resources, water, happens because they were artificially compressed into a country by the British called Sudan. And so, just to go back to the Philippines and the problem of comparisons, uneven development happens in a continent. That's why you have this famous meme that ridicules Westerners for thinking that Africa is a country. Africa is several countries, but uneven development happens within a country as well, and that's what has happened in the Philippines. And in many ways, there is also settler colonization that has impacted Mindanao negatively far more than other parts of the Philippines, and that's why perhaps many of the Mindanaoans listening now should find the time to look at the report of the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission, TJRC, created to examine the Bangsa-Moro conflict. It was part of the peace agreement. I did help set up the TJRC and help it with the process and the writing of the report. And it's a rich source of discussion around uneven development and its consequences for Filipinos.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this opens up whole levels of discussion and all. That's why I said, how I wish I had more than 30 seconds and how I wish I was smart enough to not even go down that road. Perhaps in retrospect, I realized that. And more importantly, marami na mga kaubayan natin from Mindanao said, like, Richard, you have a voice, you have a platform, you're sought after by the biggest media in the world. Maybe you have to be extra sensitive, and absolutely, I'll sit with that. So in that sense, it's a learning lesson for me. Although I stand by my argument that if you look at Human Development Index, albeit imperfect, but much better than GDP per capita in terms of capturing human development or overall development standards, there is malaki pa rin yung agwat, at isa yan sa dahilan na bakit ang lakas ng ang lakas ng yung interest or passion or yung push for
Mm-hmm.
federalism in certain regions of the country, kasi there's this understanding that Imperial Manila, or supposed Imperial Manila, too much concentrates wealth and power, and that other regions, including Visayas
Right.
region, are not given due. But I think if people bother to see the interview, I also made comparisons to the MAGA movement. Basically, my point was, actually, this is what's interesting, Ruben. I was pushing back against this Orientalist portrayals of the Philippines as this kind of like, oh my God, those people, they vote for someone like Duterte. And I wanted to say to actually the American audience, because this was CNN, you got your MAGA. You have no
All
reason
right. Yeah.
to make, or like, hello, you want to go down that road? I mean, Italy, look at the
Yeah.
current government, right? Basically post-fascist, right? And then look at Alternative for Deutschland in Netherlands, in
Mm-hmm.
it's number two.
Yeah.
So, like, basically, my idea was that there's nothing surprising with alt-right, right-wing populists like Duterte having enduring appeal. That was the context. But anyway, it got out of control. But you mentioned something very important, which is transitional justice, which I want to go back to soon, Ruben. But I want to go back also first to yung discussion natin last time. When we talked about ICC last year, Ruben, you seem to be a bit more skeptical than the rest of us. because I was at The Hague third quarter of last year, and I caught wind of some very well-informed people who said that ICC is actually already communicating and seeking cooperation from the Philippine government. Let me use the term unimpeachable source, right? And perhaps my sense is too much negotiation went on, and that's why it took this long. But
Mhm.
nevertheless, it happened. Finally, Duterte arrested and taken to the ICC. What is your read of first legality of that? I know people have heard already with Raul Pangalangan, the former ICC judge, who we hope to have on this show also soon. But I want to first of all understand what is your understanding of the legality of circumstances of Duterte being taken there based on precedents, including some sub-Saharan warlords,
Mhm.
si Dominic Onowen, right, who was
Yeah.
also in the ICC before, and also were you surprised? Were you surprised?
I think that even Rodrigo Duterte was not surprised. Um, Hubris, yes, he has that, but at the same time, I think somewhere inside him, he knew it would happen. He just didn't know how it would happen, and how it in fact happened. Happened in to me at least, and other lawyers who, including Rodrigo Duterte's lawyer Nick Kaufman, can dispute this. But the simplest way to put it is that the ICC is not interested in how a country, how a government, how a state that affects the arrest of a person did it. For as long as one standard is that person arrested is given a fair trial at the ICC in this case, and as long as it wasn't egregious, that's also why, in a way, you have the Duterte spokespersons labeling this as a kidnapping or extraordinary rendition. And the problem with calling it extraordinary rendition is that you also minimize what in fact is the horrific consequences of extraordinary rendition. This is the CIA kidnapping people so that they will be tortured in a third country.
Um, Taken to
Yep.
Guantanamo.
Or Guantanamo, yeah. So the ICC hasn't explicitly ruled on the question of if an arrest were carried out in a way that might have um, irregularity, and then the person is brought into its custody. Is that an issue that can be raised at the ICC? It has been raised, but it hasn't been ruled on in an explicit way by which we now have a standard. You mentioned Dominic Ongwen, and that it's one example, but there will never be exact examples because Ongwen surrendered, but he surrendered to several countries until he was in the custody of the United States, which used to have an Africa command, and the U.S. in effect turned him over to the ICC. The U.S. is not a party to the treaty. Dominic Ongwen voluntarily, it is said, surrendered. You have Laurent Gbagbo, former president of the Ivory Coast, was arrested with the help of the French and was not able or did not, in fact, file any kind of case in an Ivory Coast court to challenge his arrest, was brought to the ICC. And yet, Dominic Ongwen was convicted, person who surrendered, but Laurent Gbagbo, who was taken, arrested, was acquitted. So you also have different outcomes in this case, but what they have in common is they had a fair trial.
It's a fair trial. And I want to talk about other cases. This is not ICC per se, but we can go from Adolf Eichmann to Alvarez Machain. There are many cases whereby,
Mm-hmm.
sovereign state in behalf of the victims. In the case of Eichmann, the victims of the horrible genocide, the Holocaust during the Nazi regime, and in the case of Alvarez Machain, this is the EA and the U.S. taking a narcos related doctor
Mm-hmm.
justice. Do those precedents also have a relevance to the ICC when it comes to the jurisdictional issue or circumstances of taking them to face trial there?
Well, those examples do bring up a Latin maxim might that is relevant here. The maxim is "mala captus, bene detentus," a bad capture but a good detention, an irregular arrest but a valid holding of custody for trial. Like I said, the ICC has not ruled on what constitutes that principle that then allows for the trial to go ahead as long as it's fair. The Eichmann case was, in a way, what distilled this question, because they abducted him from Argentina. Israeli agents abducted him from
Sorry.
Argentina, yeah, brought him to Israel for trial, and raises the question: can you do that? Can you just abduct a person that you want to prosecute, and then conduct a fair trial? And the Israeli court dealt with that question, said that the arrest can only be the irregularity of the arrest can only be raised by the country in which whose sovereignty was
So Argentina.
um, yes was violated. And but at that point Argentina and Israel had closed the matter.
Right.
So in this case, if you apply that standard, then there were other standards, of course, but that was one of the most significant. It's the Philippine government that allowed for this arrest to happen, that cooperated with the ICC. What about the argument that the Philippines is no longer a state party to the ICC? It doesn't matter, because a non-state party can cooperate with the ICC. There's that additional argument that
This is
the Philippine law.
and the Ukraine-Russia case. Like Russia is not a part of the ICC. I don't think even Ukraine was part of the ICC when the Putin warrant for arrest came. Is Israel part of the ICC, or Taliban
Israel, yes, many of the countries that have whose leaders have warrants of arrest are not part of the ICC. Sudan is not part of the ICC. Russia is not part of the ICC. Israel is not part of the ICC. The United States is not part of the ICC. And Israel has, in fact, questioned the ICC's jurisdiction to issue warrants of arrest for Netanyahu and its former defense minister. I must say this before I forget this point. Duterte's lawyer is some newspaper accounts describe him as a British lawyer, but he's an Israeli lawyer who was born in the UK. And he has worked for the Israeli government. He was a prosecutor who prosecuted many Palestinians. Without going into the details of these various cases he has prosecuted, many of them were falsely arrested. And he, as much as any Israeli lawyer, knows that many Palestinians have in fact not even been tried but are still detained. We have seen them being released because many of them were never tried properly. No fair trial, as I said earlier. But the reason I point that out now is that many countries that are not party to the ICC are given the opportunity to challenge jurisdiction at the ICC, which is what the Marcos Jr. government in fact did in 2022 and 2020. No, in 2023 at the ICC, challenged the ICC's jurisdiction to open an investigation, and brought it up all the way to the appellate level of the ICC, where there was a ruling by 5 judges. 3 said you can't raise jurisdiction because we never discussed that at the pretrial chamber when the investigation was opened. 2 judges said you did discuss jurisdiction because you said, there was a mention of language there. But that 3-2 decision allowed the prosecutor to continue with the investigation and eventually to issue warrants of arrest. That question of jurisdiction will come back, and it will come back in Duterte's case before September 2025.
And the Supreme Court of the Philippines also mentioned residual jurisdiction. So my understanding is that the Supreme Court has also kind of settled this issue in its own ways. Is the case of I think this is Mr. Kaufman, right? I think it was recommended by Harry Roque, I was told. And again, this goes back to Harry Roque, right? Some would say Harry Roque is the ambulance chaser, but is Harry Roque the best person to recommend someone else to be Duterte's lawyer? And how Harry was not taken as a lawyer? Is it because he was deemed as not competent enough or too problematic and liability, basically?
It's hard to judge what clients are thinking when they choose their lawyers, and it's even harder because this is the ICC and you have a limited roster of lawyers you can choose from. There are many lawyers in that roster that I know and I've worked with. My work in the ICC has focused on victims and the process of reparations that they are entitled to and participation during trial that they're entitled to. In fact, I did work for the court in one case where Nick Kaufman was the lawyer for a defendant. And maybe that case, in fact, might have significance here in many ways because
What case is
it dealt with
for the
the
purpose of?
Bemba case.
Aha, right.
Jean-Pierre Bemba.
Can we give a summary to those who are not familiar? Kasi ang dami nagtatanong sa akin about Mr. Kaufman, his background, is he competent, bakit siya yung kinuha? So for the education of people, because you have dealt with this gentleman.
Well, the Bemba case involved several defendants. Jean-Pierre Bemba himself was at that time the vice president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country that neighbors another African country called the Central African Republic. And troops under the command of Bemba went inside the CAR, the Central African Republic, upon the invitation of the president there to suppress a rebellion by another armed group. But in the course of coming into the country, Bemba's troops committed pillage, murder, rape. Hundreds of people were killed, thousands were pillaged, many women were raped. Some of them contracted HIV as a result of that. It took many years before Bemba was charged, and it took almost a decade before he was finally convicted. And in the course of that, Nick Kaufman represented, if I'm not mistaken, Bemba himself at some point because Bemba had different lawyers over the course of that. Imagine it's a decade of proceedings. But at the end of this entire set of proceedings, Bemba was acquitted. One of the crucial questions was whether Bemba's assets could be frozen while he was on trial. And this is something that would be interesting to discuss if we had more time, because the ICC's Office of the Prosecutor does not have a lot of resources and people looking at this part of the ICC's mandate, which is the ICC is allowed to freeze, identify and freeze assets of persons charged at the ICC so that the assets are preserved, among others, when there is a conviction and reparations must be given to victims of the convicted person. Bemba's family is wealthy. His father was formerly finance minister of the DRC under the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko and owned the DRC's largest airline, in fact, the only airline. He has houses in Portugal. So the ICC prosecutor, took steps to freeze these assets, but they were eventually unfrozen upon Bemba's acquittal. This question of freezing assets is important because this is one way to fund reparations for victims at the ICC. That was one part I worked on.
Right, I see. Okay, it's the reparation part, which is something we'll discuss soon with the EJK victims in the Philippines. No. So.
Oh, and you were asking about Nick Kaufman, and so yeah, he has appeared in several other cases. He also worked in Cambodia at the extraordinary chambers, if I'm not mistaken, as well as at the ICTY, the chamber for
in behalf of the Pol Pot people?
For defendants.
Oh.
He used to work in the prosecutor's office under, I think, Bensuda or maybe Karim Khan. I'm not sure, but yes, but he has since then mostly represented defendants, although he has also represented a couple of victims in victim participation and reparations proceedings. So, I mean, just as a lawyer, he has been a competent lawyer.
Because I told people he's actually quite competent. People were saying, hindi, pero na-endorse yan ni Harry, baka ganyan. So, sa pagkaalam ko, well, again, I'm not gonna try to play the Oxbridge thing, but he's a Cambridge.
My reservation, if I might say so, I might use the word reservation about him, is that he has also participated in producing this guide uh, commissioned by an Israeli publication to help soldiers of the IDF escape accountability when they are in a foreign country. Of course, one can argue that these soldiers, are entitled to due process, are entitled to, be treated fairly. But at the same time, I think it does say something about one's choices, moral choices as a lawyer.
Sense of patriotic duty. Actually, we have people, Shalom, joining us from there watching. There are many people interested in this case because there's so many layers to that, right? Um, I, that definitely means we have to have another discussion soon, Ruben, as soon as your schedule opens up. Especially hopefully after I have our discussion with also Raul Pangalangan. It will be nice to for you guys to complement each other. You're all very authoritative and respected sources. Ruben, I want to ask about how big of a deal this is to ICC because remember the last time we talked, you were a bit skeptical of both ICJ and the ICC on the Netanyahu issue. And I think, can I say it looks like you were a bit too skeptical? Or is it too early to say? Considering
Uh, I, I'm still skeptical. Uh, First of all, I think the comparisons will create a false
complete
outcome.
false
Yes,
complete
in the sense, yeah, in the sense that um, Israel, Russia, uh, these are countries that are not only not parties to the ICC, but are powerful countries.
they are powerful country. I mean, just to be more
Yes, and the the problem of powerful countries isn't just limited to countries that are not party to the ICC. The United Kingdom is party to the ICC. It's a powerful country. Um, One of the earliest investigations at the ICC was against UK soldiers involved in the Iraq War, and the UK argued that it was carrying out its own investigations on war crimes allegedly committed by its soldiers, and asked the ICC prosecutor to dismiss the case. And there was so much pressure on the ICC prosecutor to do that that she eventually agreed. And the that pressure is precisely the problem here, because there was and still continues to be inequality in the way power and influence happens, not just at the ICC, but at the United Nations. You have a Security Council where technically the UN Security Council can refer cases to the ICC, can ask the prosecutor to open an investigation. And that was how, for example, the Libya case came about. So my skepticism is not at the ICC as an institution. I think it is an institution that comes with the progressive development of international criminal law, but at the way the ICC can operate in a world where power is distributed unequally. Now, my
select
skepticism,
and selectively because I want to emphasize this.
yes,
I know we have short time, sorry, so I'm a bit cutting you because I want to go to the most
sure.
important discussion, transitional justice. I know you have another meeting, and we can go back to this some of these issues. For me, it's interesting that first of all, they dared to issue the warrants of arrest for Netanyahu, considering knowing how powerful Israel is, and not to mention the U.S. aspect. It's also interesting that the Trump administration, which was extremely critical of ICC and sanctioning them and threatening Karim Khan's
Mhm.
even is eerily silent on the Duterte issue, which tells you there's selectiveness also. Like we don't mind if it's I don't know. Well, during Biden, we don't mind if it's Putin, and now we don't mind if it's Duterte. From my understanding, they were even interested in knowing bakit may delay pa dun sa flight ni Digong. So here you can also
Yeah.
see hypocrisy and expediency.
Although I should add that it took Karim Khan a long time to ask for the warrants in the Israel situation versus the 2 weeks it took him to ask for the warrants in the Ukraine situation.
The book of
Because the Israeli situation had already been pending since 2021 at the earliest, but it took 30,000 people, Palestinian lives, before he asked for a warrant. But in Ukraine, 2 weeks. asked for the warrant against Putin. So it's difficult enough for an institution like the ICC to operate in an unequal world, but when you have a prosecutor who sometimes has reinforced that inequality, that's why I remain skeptical.
I don't disagree with that critique. What I'm saying is that I think the fact that this warrant of arrest against Duterte came eventually, much later than we thought, but nevertheless it came. And the fact that this could be the only really big
Mm-hmm.
fish caught by ICC makes me slightly more optimistic that ICC will really take this seriously. I mean, you said Kaufman had a case of acquitting someone involved allegedly in mass atrocities, but many would say they're not so optimistic about Duterte getting acquitted, or at least this case being resolved very fastly in favor of Duterte. What is your prognostication? Are we looking at 2 to 3 years trial here? Are we looking at more or less an airtight case? What is your read of that?
Well, sometimes the question that is asked of me is, can Duterte go home soon? And the answer is no, because there are going to be proceedings that will have to happen, and not just the September hearing. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
Nonetheless, I should.
Pre-trial pa lang in September. I mean, just to remind people.
It's called the confirmation of charges hearing. You will be told what the charges are in detail with the evidence. This week they will exchange evidence, yeah, but mainly that's the prosecution supplying evidence to the defense, what we know, and here's what it is. But jurisdiction will be raised, and I will say, regardless of my thoughts around accountability and the importance of providing justice for victims of the drug war that Duterte presided over, there is, in fact, a serious jurisdictional legal question. It doesn't go into the morality of it. It doesn't go into the politics of it. It goes into the technical aspects of it, which is the part about lawyering that I hate the most. Uh, but it will be raised, and it obviously has to be raised. It might go into the arrest a little bit, but more importantly, it goes into the question of uh, the consequences of withdrawing from the ICC and the timing of the examination that led to the investigation. And this is where our discussion just a moment ago about
Realities.
Karim Khan and how slow or how fast he works becomes important, because the investigation was opened after the withdrawal had taken effect, but an earlier stage called the examination had happened
Yes,
before
exactly.
that withdrawal.
The
The
former.
two dissenting judges actually not just pointed it out, but said that the trigger for determining whether jurisdiction was acquired isn't when the crimes were committed, which is Davao and the drug war nationwide, but when this step was taken. And that will be raised. And so there is a possibility that this case will be decided not after a trial, but after the determination of jurisdiction.
Oh, so you're saying in a most optimistic scenario, the Duterte side can get this done by September?
Before September.
Oh, wow.
If
So
it depends, because I don't know how fast the judges work these days.
So,
Obviously they'll ask the pretrial chamber first.
ito, di ba, Ruben? If we can put it that way, this is quite a sui generis case also to a certain degree. Can we say that? That some of our precedents may not provide a perfect timeline or blueprint of understanding of the timeline and how this is going to go?
Yeah, well, I think because the Filipinos are obviously the most that have a stake in this outcome, it's important for Filipinos, especially lawyers, but also non-lawyers, to disabuse themselves of what they think a trial or a court process, a criminal trial should be, because they see it on Philippine TV or even American shows. This is the ICC. It's sui generis, like you said.
And it's more,
Um,
right? Because our legal infrastructure and software is more American jurisprudence, while ICC operates on a very European model, jurisprudentially speaking.
well, it's a mix of many things, and not just because all these examples that we're talking about are colonial legal systems. So there are those examples of that are fused into the ICC process, but you also have individual variations by country of those examples. You have a Mexican judge here. You have a judge from Benin, where the French civil law system is used. You have a Romanian judge, which has had a fusion of,
Also, yeah.
European and Soviet and post-Soviet practices. So the ICC's jurisprudence is not settled in many, many aspects of the law, and this is one of them.
We're going towards the last part, but very important part. Pag-usapan natin, one of the issues raised with the Philippine government is that the Marcos administration has not come in from a purely principled position, meaning it was questioning the jurisdiction issue itself back in the day. And some are saying it's hard to separate this from the ongoing power struggle, which I will blame the Dutertes. I mean, it's the Dutertes who have been forcing the case. It's their fault also in a way, triggering Marcos. Knowing Marcos Jr., I don't think he's like his dad, the kind who will go first. I think he was really going into this from a very reluctant and defensive position. But having said that, what are the things that the Philippine government can do to strengthen the ICC case now that they have crossed the Rubicon already? I mean, kung babalik si Duterte, yari na rin sila, diba? It's gonna be like what? I don't know, civil war or something. It's like return of, I don't know, Caesar or whatever. Can the Philippine government help the ICC case by also forming its own Truth Commission, Justice Commission, and also pushing the next Congress to rejoin the ICC? Could that have a positive bearing on making sure this is as airtight as possible and that accountability questions, the jurisdiction questions will not hold water? For
There's
that our systems have failed, right? So I think that's a Remulla line. Our court systems have failed, our justice system have failed, kaya pumasok yung ICC. Is it important for the Philippine government to keep on hammering that issue?
uh, the problem is that the answer should be yes, but these are not the persons who should be hammering on that issue, even if they're officially Justice Secretary, Interior Secretary, or which has supervision over the police, because these are also the very people who objected to jurisdiction, raised questions about it, and have not cured what they did by taking what they should be doing right now, which is simply acknowledging that there are victims of the drug war whose lives have been upturned by what happened to them, whether they're from Davao. That mother in Davao who lost 4 of her sons
Yeah,
to
grabe.
Duterte's drug war. Her case is not part of the ICC case because it happened before the ICC was created, before the Philippines joined the ICC. What do you do with her? She, in interviews, she has said she's still grateful that this has happened, but her gratitude that does not make her life better, does not soothe her loss. The Philippine government should, and I've written about this, should perhaps open a truth-seeking process into the drug war that does not care about the legal aspects of it as much as the
Compensatory.
yes, as much as the human aspects of it. What it did to Filipino lives, what it did not just to mostly poor families, whether they are families with people who were using drugs or people who never used drugs, whether they are families who tried to deal with their crisis or did not deal with their crisis. They did not deserve their family members to be murdered in the streets by policemen or by mass vigilantes. But it also will help, a truth commission also will help deal with the disinformation that has simply smothered any honest, sober, and helpful discussion about drug use in the Philippines, about justice in the Philippines, about inequality. And most of all, a truth commission will help Filipinos understand that their redemption will not come from a Marcos or from a Duterte, from a Remulla or a Romualdez. These are all people with blood on their hands. And even if they go after each other, that will not change the inequality in the Philippines.
We're towards the end of this. The reason I raised the issue of Truth Commission and the Justice and who knows, even Reconciliation Commission is because speaking of Duterte, and I don't know if you rate this Bato and others could be next, that there could be waves of arrest. That still leaves a lot of mid-ranking or low-ranking police.
Yes.
So basically, it raises questions of security sector reform in a very serious,
Yeah.
systematic, institutional sense. You are a transitional justice specialist, Attorney Ruben Caranza. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because a generational challenge, to, di ba? It took so long for AFP to go through security sector reform.
Right. And, one country that has, in fact, had a truth commission that dealt with a drug war is Mexico. And Mexico has its own problems with its security sector. The army has been used to fight drug cartels.
That's
The
basically
police has been
true, right? If people watch Narco season, yeah, the
right,
Mexican.
and you can see that there it is a drug war. It is a war between two armed combatants, the state and the cartels. This is not poor people in some urban poor neighborhood in Manila or in Cebu or in Davao being slaughtered by police or vigilantes. But a truth commission was created in Mexico. I will not say that it was very effective, but it did allow people to come forward without fear because the state was behind them. The state was telling them, I will protect you when you speak up. And this is how discussions around disappearances in Mexico caused by the drug war has been opened up and has led to some efforts at finding the disappeared. So it's important in the Philippines as well because you cannot just allow the Philippine National Police to be the weapon of a president who wants to kill his own people, thousands of them. He did. Duterte did say he wanted to be Hitler, slaughter his own people, and now he's getting an Israeli lawyer. So I see the irony in all of that. Um, but there's also the need for reparations for victims of the drug war, and the Philippines has seen that. A law was passed many years ago. I helped draft that law to provide reparations for victims of the Marcos dictatorship. I think that Marcos Jr. is perhaps afraid of opening this discussion because, really, in the end, he himself and his family might be held accountable.
Rabbit hole for a lot of, many people get implicated. Also, just to be clear, Duterte personally apologized at the synagogue after that horrible and horrendous statement regarding Hitler, and I think it was one of the very few times he really apologized. And I think June Vasco, someone no one remembers nowadays, played an important role, but that's a whole different conversation. The Bongo and Vasco thing, and then now Bongo and Sara thing. Um, um,
After
last,
which Israel kept supplying him weapons to continue his drug war.
um, it's a long conversation on that. Is there just for the purpose of our audience, Ruben, before we part for hopefully just a beginning of a long conversation, because a lot is going to happen in ICC soon. Again, my understanding is in the months and weeks,
Mhm.
if not years. May you tell us anong sinulat mo ukol sa issue na yan that people can check, and what are your other relevant publications? Because I think people are now really hungry for understanding
Sure.
jurisprudential and juridical concerns kasi historic to eh, makasaysayan to
Mhm.
eh. The Philippines,
So first
please.
of all, I think it's important for people to know where I work. I work at the International Center for Transitional Justice, ICTJ. So ictj.org is the website. It has several publications that are relevant for Filipinos. I've written a 2017 piece on what transitional justice can do in relation to this drug war. Um, I'll post that on my Facebook because I think that's where people can see, and I'll send it
Now,
to you as well. You can link to it. But we have also actually published several pieces around Mexico and Colombia, two countries that have had drug wars, and dealt with them through both truth seeking and prosecutions, and not through the ICC. But at the ICC, I think it's important for Filipinos to actually look at the Tagalog or Filipino language documents that are there. There's a Filipino version of the warrant of arrest. There's a Filipino version of the some of the annexes to the warrant of arrest showing the investigative steps. As a matter of fact, there's a Cebuano version that describes this process. The ICC is taking the effort to help Filipinos understand this process because this is a process that, as we said, is unique and yet is also historic for Filipinos.
So both sui generis and universal. Ako, I always go back to that movie 1985 about the desaparecidos in
Mhm.
Argentina and how, public opinion really shifted in the right direction, including those who were coming from military families when they really listened to the story of rape and torture and survivors of extrajudicial killings
Right.
during Argentinian dictatorship. So I really hope, there are fantastic books out there about the war on drugs and all of that. But I want to hear more from the victims themselves. That's why it's very important that authorities and civil society groups protect these victims. I mean, Ruben, it's so crazy. People talking about tanim biktima. I mean,
Yeah.
that's false narrative and disinformation online.
Right.
Not my words about HDI and sub-Saharan Africa. It's so crazy. They're even attacking the victims. And Attorney
Yeah.
Conti.
This dehumanization is terrible, and in the coming weeks, I expect that there will be more threats against these families and Filipinos and non-Filipinos who are have justice in their hearts, have to help protect these families. These are powerless families. These are families. You know where I've met many of them, Richard. I had to meet them in another country. Just a few of them could travel. We had some funding to bring them to a discussion. That was how difficult it was for me to meet with them. I had to talk to the late Father Amado Picardal, one of those who documented the killings in Davao. He passed away last year, but I had to meet him somewhere else because he was himself afraid for his life. So this fear for lives of people seeking justice will increase in the coming days, and I hope Filipinos, with justice in their hearts, will help.
Yes, Ruben, thank you so much for that. I know, I mean, it's good that we recognize that there's a double injustice among people. It's one thing to take away their loved ones under the most suspicious and egregious circumstances, another thing to gaslight them and blame them and deny
Yeah.
their and it just tells you how profound the problem here is. And kaya nga sabi ko, generational problem ito. And for us millennials and the Gen Z and next generation, malaking trabaho namin. Thank you, Ruben, for being a paragon of humanity, I'll say that, and also a beacon of legal education for us. And I hope we can have you more and more on our show, and hopefully in person also soon if I drop by there or you drop by wherever I am, because I think many people are super excited to know about this because this is really a historic case. At the same time, it has universal resonance, and I know this because I deal with international media and many folks. And in the coming days and weeks, I hope to talk to other experts and officials from across the world who are very interested in this. Mabuhay kay Ruben, Attorney Ruben Caranza, one of the leading specialists as far as, this Filipino leading specialist on transitional justice. And sana, this is just a beginning of a long series of good conversations about how international law is catching up with the dark reality of foreign drugs and atrocities against sa ating mga kaubayan and among other folks. Salamat, Ruben.
Salamat, Richard.
God bless.
Talk
Thank
to
you.